You are standing in the center of a crowded city square. The ground violently shakes. Then a deafening, unnatural roar echoes from the mountain above. A massive wall of black mud and glacial ice is accelerating down the valley at 180 miles per hour. You cannot outrun it. You cannot hide. You have exactly 3 minutes left to live. Where do you run when the earth decides to bury you? Yungay, Peru was a vibrant, deeply historic city. It sat quietly in a lush green valley directly beneath the towering peaks of Mount Huascaran. At over 22,000 feet, the mountain is capped with millions of heavy glacial ice. To the people of Yungay, the mountain was a beautiful, silent. They didn't realize they were living in the crosshairs of a loaded gun. On May 31st, 1970, the city was completely full. It was a Sunday afternoon, and nearly 25,000 people were bustling through the narrow streets. At 3:23 p.m., the ground began to violently heave. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake ripped directly through the coast of Peru. In the city, brick walls cracked and heavy roof tiles shattered onto them. But the real danger was not the trembling ground. It was what the earthquake had just done to the peak of the mountain. High above the city, the violent shaking destabilized the heavily fractured northern peak of Huascaran. A massive, solid block of glacial ice simply sheared off the rock face. It was almost a mile long and over 100 feet thick. It began to fall. The ice plummeted 10,000 feet down the near vertical cliff. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact instantly pulverized the ice. It flash melted into water, mixing immediately with millions of loose rock, dirt, and boulders. It transformed from a falling glacier into a massive, highly fluid debris avalanche. And this is where the timeline accelerates into pure horror. The volume of the mudslide was completely incomprehensible. It contained over 50 million cubic meters of heavy debris. It was dropping directly into the steep, narrow funnel of the valley. Gravity accelerated the black mass to an estimated 180 miles per hour. Down in Yungay, the earthquake had just stopped. People were stepping out of their damaged homes, checking on their neighbors. Then they heard the noise. Survivors later described it as the sound of 10,000 jet engines screaming at once. The ground began to vibrate with a completely different, heavy rhythm. The citizens looked up towards the canyon. A massive, churning wall of black mud was completely blocking out the sky. It was over 100 feet high, carrying jagged boulders the size of commercial houses, and it was only 3 minutes away. Panic instantly paralyzed the city streets. There were no warning sirens, and there was absolutely no evacuation protocol. You cannot outdrive a wave moving at nearly 200 miles per hour. Cases like this prove that nature can erase us in an absolute instant. And if documenting the darkest moments of history is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because what happened in the next 60 seconds defies all logic. Thousands of people began to run blindly in every direction. Parents grabbed their children and sprinted towards the massive local cathedral. They desperately hoped the heavy stone walls would protect them from the impact. It was a fatal miscalculation. The heavy mud would soon crush the church like a fragile wooden toy. But a small group of people looked at the geography of the city and realized their only chance. Sitting on a highly elevated terraced hill on the extreme edge of town was the local cemetery. It was a massive, stepped structure built heavily into the bedrock. It was the highest point in the entire valley. A traveling circus had set up their tents near the cemetery that afternoon. Dozens of young children had gathered to watch the animals. When the deafening roar echoed down the valley, a clown screamed for the children to run up the steps. Hundreds of people frantically scrambled up the steep stone terraces. They were tripping over gravestones, desperately dragging each other upward by their clothes. They reached the absolute highest tier of the cemetery and turned around. The wall of mud hit the edge of the city. It did not just flood the streets, it violently erased them. The sheer mass of the debris instantly pulverized brick houses, heavy cars, and thousands of running people. The noise was absolutely blinding. The survivors stood on the cemetery steps, watching the black tide rise up the terraces right beneath them. The mud violently swallowed the first level of graves. Then it swallowed the second. It stopped just inches below the highest platform, and then the massive wave rolled past them, continuing aggressively down the valley. The roar was suddenly replaced by an absolute heavy silence. A thick cloud of brown dust hung in the air, choking the few hundred people standing on the hill. As the dust slowly cleared, they looked down at their city. It was completely gone. Yungay had been entirely wiped off the map. Where 25,000 people had just been standing, there was nothing but a flat, gray ocean of thick mud. No buildings, no roads, no survivors in the debris. The entire event, from the moment the ice fractured to the final silence, took exactly 3 minutes. The survivors were completely stranded on the cemetery hill. They were trapped on a tiny island in a sea of wet, highly unstable concrete. They were entirely isolated. They had to sit in the dirt and listen to the agonizing quiet of a dead city. They knew their families, their friends, and their homes were buried just a few feet below the mud. It took days for military helicopters to finally reach the isolated valley. The pilots looking down from the sky could not even figure out where the city used to be. The landscape was completely unrecognizable. Out of a massive, thriving population, only 300 people survived the Huascaran avalanche. Nearly 25,000 men, women, and children were buried alive in a single violent instant. But the most chilling part of the disaster was the physical evidence left behind. The mud was incredibly dense and packed with pulverized rock. As it dried under the harsh Peruvian sun, it hardened into solid, unyielding concrete. The government quickly realized that digging through 30 feet of rock to recover the bodies was mathematically and physically impossible. They officially declared the entire valley a national cemetery. They left the dead exactly where they fell. Today, if you visit the site of the Yungay disaster, you will not see heavy ruins. You will just see a massive, completely flat field. But poking out of the grass are a few stark, highly disturbing landmarks. 4 original palm trees that somehow survived the impact still stand perfectly in the center of the field. And just a few yards away, the very top of cathedral spires poke out of the dirt. The rest of the massive church is buried 30 feet straight down. It is a permanent, physical marker, exact depth of the trap. The cemetery hill still stands above it, quietly watching over the grass. It is a beautiful, deeply silent place. They found the cathedral spire sticking out of the ground. They found the few children who ran to the high graves, but the 25,000 people sleeping in the mud never saw the sun again.